Welcome to another seminar of the monthly series in critical psychology hosted by Stillpoint. I'm Maria Laguna, and today we will be discussing the impact of social, political, and economic power on our bodies. We will discuss the practices and discourses that exercise control over our bodies and those that can lead to our empowerment and emancipation. Thanks for joining, and I hope you enjoy. Critical psychology is concerned with how power works. It wonders how various forms of oppression and inequality exist as a result of it, and the ways in which this power can be resisted. Critical psychology also wants to know the role that mainstream psychology plays in maintaining and extending relations of power. The goal of this lecture is not to demonize power, but understand the different ways in which it can impact our lives for better or for worse. Today, we will be reflecting on how critical psychology helps us think differently about our relationships within and between our bodies. How does mainstream psychology regulate what happens in our bodies and between bodies? What are some narratives that promote freedom and which ones promote oppression of our body? When it comes to thinking about the topic of power over our bodies, it is impossible not to mention Michel Foucault, a French philosopher, historian of ideas, writer, political activist, and literary critic. Foucault has had a profound influence on the study of power and resistance. He introduced several notions that can help us understand the impact of power relationships over life. One of these notions is the notion of biopower, in other words, power over life. Foucault's theory tends to be misinterpreted as showing how modern forms of power are evil. However, what Foucault and in this seminar we're more interested in is in exploring how our bodies are subjected to power relationships that have the power to create, protect, or harm. Power can be productive and oppressive, creative or destructive. Foucault's theory sheds light on the ways in which power has the potential to oppress and marginalize certain people. This is also the interest of critical psychology. According to Foucault, at the beginning of the 17th century, populations became the principal target of power from institutions. This is what he calls biopower. As a technique of governance, biopower controls certain population groups deemed unproductive or dangerous while enhancing and fostering the life of certain part of the population through disallowing the life of another. Why is this concept helpful? First, it shows how certain categories to classify bodies are used to enact and allow violence on certain people. Second, it helps us understand the creation of otherness. Finally, it helps us see that power goes beyond politics and it exists in our everyday lives. According to Foucault, there are two forms of biopower: anatomopolitics and biopolitics. Anatomopolitics relates to the administration of life at the individual level. It involves the practices that we engage with our bodies, practices that help us behave more productively and usefully. It pertains to practices that may make us more healthy and functional, but also more useful and docile. For Foucault, even running, for example, which appears to be a very simple activity, is an example of anatomopolitics. Why is that? Because it involves a lot of discipline and control over the body, and it involves a whole market surrounding this practice, from special running shoes, clothes, tracking devices to measure and control our heart rate, speed, calories burned, etc. Another example of anatomopolitics are the many self-disciplining practices that emerge as a result of dissatisfaction with our bodies. The discourses in social media, among others, makes it harder and harder for us to be kinder and accepting of our body image. Here are some statistics. Dissatisfaction with our bodies can lead to the practice of self-monitoring, which, once again, although not necessarily negative, when done compulsively, it can lead to excessive discipline and excessive control over our bodies, counting calories, counting steps, inches and pounds gained, etc. Can you think of other examples of anatomopolitics? What are some other examples in which power and control is exercised over individual bodies? Feel free to share comments in the chat box or in the comment section if you're watching this via YouTube. Back to biopower. The second form it takes is called biopolitics. This refers to the exercise of power and administration of human life at the population level. Biopolitics involves a series of interventions whose purpose is regulation and control over the population. Biopolitics targets the whole population and biological processes such as births, deaths, levels of health, reproductive health, longevity, etc. Biopolitics can thus be understood as a type of biopower that targets collectivities. The object of the power is not individual, but a specific group of people, such as an entire race, an entire country, or any segment of the global population. Biopolitics, then, is a form of power exercised by institutions that seeks to foster life and targets the growth, productivity, or health of the populations, managing lives through nutrition, medicine, reproductive behavior, demographic policies, food security, etc. One positive example of biopolitics is the government imposition on lockdowns and curfews during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a form of biopower that aims to control the entire populations to ensure their survival and slow the spread of a very contagious virus. A not so productive and painfully relevant example of biopolitics is the example of war. Some government discourse on patriotism can serve as a political tool to mobilize a population and selectively use it for political purposes. Another example of biopolitics relates to all the institutional practices that intend to control the body image, sexual health, and birth control of entire populations. Just like anatomopolitics, biopolitics can have benign functions, but when used incorrectly, it can turn into a system of control and segregation, prioritizing some bodies over others. This leads to discrimination and domination of marginalized groups. Another example of biopolitics is the social objectification of bodies. A lot of emphasis has been placed on women's body size, shape, facial characteristics, way of dressing, presentation, etc. In all of these areas, we find social prescriptions for the construction of the ideal femininity. Women are expected to attain a certain image which is not realistic for the vast majority of us. In Western societies, slim bodies continues to be regarded as a sign of health, wellness, success, and attractiveness. Men's bodies are also affected. They tend to be represented as strong, healthy, and invulnerable by different cultural messages. Men being socialized into these forms of masculinity, tend to not pay attention to changes in one's body, for example, neglecting physical symptoms in order to keep up with the social mandate of being strong and invulnerable. The social prescription of able-bodied people as morally desirable and quote-unquote normal, it's another example of a biopolitical narrative. Even in more inclusive discourses, biopolitics operates in a way that tends to favor certain disabled bodies over others. For example, some biopolitical discourses choose certain bodies as exemplars in order to bolster an ideology of neoliberal inclusiveness. However, prioritizing certain disabled bodies over others has the potential to marginalize people. For example, people who have disabilities that are not easily visible. Some people argue that biopolitics makes some disabled subjects hypervisible in order to render other disabled subjects invisible and beyond the bounds of neoliberalism. Another example is the social problem of health access inequality, which became more apparent during the COVID-19 pandemic. People who benefit from existing systems such as education, housing, and healthcare are more likely to be white and of higher socioeconomic status. On the contrary, people who are marginalized have less access to resources and less choices to decrease the risk of getting COVID. This shows that not all bodies are regarded with the same urgency and level of care. Controlling the growth of the population and developing policies according to this function is another example of biopolitics. While in some segments of society the state is concerned with promoting procreation and providing incentives to parenthood, in other segments of society the state is concerned with containing and preventing population growth. Travel bans and forced relocations are another modern example of biopolitics. It's no surprise that the most recent wave of travel restrictions due to COVID disproportionately affects people of color, while emphasizing on allocating resources to more privileged populations. Biopolitics creates a specific discourse around how people should be, act, or look. It shapes narratives of what is normal and abnormal, and it can lead to oppression to certain groups of people whose lives are considered a threat or less valuable by the state. The biopolitical discourse around the COVID pandemic shows that not all bodies are treated equally. Not all workers are equally praised for their efforts. Doctors and nurses are definitely considered the heroes fighting the virus. However, in the dominant discourse, there are other heroes that are relegated to the background: delivery workers, teachers, transportation workers, etc. COVID made it more evident how certain lives, certain bodies, are unequally appreciated and valued. Can you think of other examples of biopolitics? Which practices of collective administration and control of the bodies can you think of? We just introduced a very summarized version of Foucault's theory of biopower, which takes two forms: anatomopolitics, which is discipline and control over individual lives, and biopolitics, which is discipline and control over entire populations. Foucault's theory has several limitations and critiques. Coming from a continental tradition, he is criticized by his Eurocentrism, elitism, and preoccupation with power. Some argue that Foucault's theory of biopolitics is very negative because it leads people to feel that there's power everywhere and therefore they may feel they don't have the power to change things. Foucault's theory focuses too much on power and not enough on the ways in which power can be resisted. If you're interested in reading more about Foucault's theory, check out the following books: The History of Sexuality and The Birth of Biopolitics. Aside from Foucauldian theory, another body of knowledge that can help us understand discourses and control over our bodies is critical health psychology. Critical health psychology is concerned with the experience of the body and the ways authorities administer it. It considers important to take the social and external factors seriously when it comes to understanding issues of health. One tool that can help us understand the impact of our environment over our health is the concept of social determinants of health. The World Health Organization states that the social determinants of health are the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. These are circumstances that are shaped by the distribution of money, power, and resources at the global, national, and local levels. The World Health Organization states that social determinants of health are mostly responsible for health inequalities, the unfair and avoidable differences in health status seen within and between countries. This graphic shows the social determinants of health: education, job status, family and social support, income, and community safety. These factors make up to 40% of what impacts a person's health. What are some examples of resistance to control over our bodies? Depending on your position, it might be possible to engage in practices that denounce forms of violence over our bodies, especially around those issues that tend to remain in the private sphere. One example of this is the issue of obstetrical and gynecological violence. This is a form of biopolitics that affects women when they're particularly vulnerable, before, during, and after childbirth. This type of violence tends to be internalized by the women who suffer it. They're told that it is one of the hazards of childbirth and that they're required to accept the pain and stop complaining. Information and awareness raising campaigns of this act of violence could alert public opinion and encourage victims of violence to find safe avenues to complain. Here are some examples of organizations committed to this mission. Critical consciousness is a term popularized by the Brazilian educator, activist, and theorist Paulo Freire in 1970 on his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This term originally comes from Frantz Fanon's coinage of a French term, consciencier, in his 1952 book Black Skins, White Masks. Paulo Freire defines critical consciousness as the ability to intervene in reality in order to change it. Once we become aware of the covert, insidious, and normalized ways in which biopower operates through conscientization, then we can have the tools to resist it. Counterconduct is another concept coined by Michel Foucault. It is defined as the struggle against processes implemented for conducting others. In other words, it's as though one was saying, I'm not going to be governed like that, by these people, and at this price. Counterconduct does not aim at influencing policies or political institutions at the more macro level. Instead, it questions normality, produces differences, and creates and experiments with new subjectivities and new ways of living. Here are two literary examples of counterconduct. Through the act of documenting their life experiences, women who tend to be silenced have a means of avoiding complete obedience in their patriarchal communities. They describe ways of living that escape stereotypes around the Arab community and shed visibility on issues otherwise hidden. A daily form of resistance is to become aware of our lived experiences of our bodies. How do we feel in our body? Our gender expression, our connections. What does it mean to be your race, your age, your size, your gender in the context that you live? An example of this is Black feminism. Black feminists tend to focus on the ways in which feminism ignores the unique experiences of Black bodies. Another example of resistance has to do with the movements against forceful displacement of bodies. For example, anti-land acquisition and anti-eviction movements. This involves communities mobilizing and putting their bodies as a defensive front against evictions or forced displacements. Attending to the ways in which bodies and subjectivities are formed in social environments, it's an important consideration of critical psychology. The power over our bodies is not inherently good or bad. What matters is how we relate to that power, the ways in which we become aware of it, and the things we do to denounce its misuse, and the ways in which we can redirect it to a more just society for all.